Look, there's some root causes at work here. Number one is racism. You can't deny it. Statistically, it shows it's happening. In Minnesota in 2001, we did a study on arrests with 60-some polices through Minnesota police forces. Clearly, it came back. Black men are pulled over way more than white men are. Black men are patted down way more than white men are. But guess what the shocker was? White men have contraband way more than black men do.
Yeah.
That's what we found in our 2001 study. Now, the other root cause we should do, Larry, end the war on drugs. That's helping this, because that's what's militarized our police. That's what make it where police violate the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, they knock down doors, and they come in shooting. It's this attitude of shoot first, ask questions later, that is all stemmed from the failed war on drugs. The war on drugs is a root cause of what you're seeing today with this problem on the streets between the people and the police.
In fact, the war on drugs is a failure, isn't it?
Totally.
It's very hard to believe we're a united nation. In 1964, two-thirds of all the people locked up in jails and prisons around this country, both local, state, and federal level, two-thirds of all the people locked up were white. Only one-third of the people locked up were people of color. That's 1964. By 1994, a mere 30 years later, those numbers had exactly flip-flopped. So that by 1994 and still today, approximately two-thirds of those who are locked up in jails or prisons around this country are people of color, mostly African-American and Latino, and only one-third are white. Now, there are only two possible theories to explain the difference between 1964 and the present. Only two possible explanations for this flip-flop in terms of who is locked up and who is not. The first is the following, and I guess maybe some people believe this, although it seems fairly laughable to me. The first theory is to say, well, after 1964, white folks woke up and just decided, we're tired of all this crime stuff we've been doing, so we're just going to shape up and fly right. We're tired of all this. We've been filling the jails and prisons, and we're over it. We're just going to stop. And then black people and Latinos, seeing that white folks were tired of crime, decided, well, hell, if they're not going to do it, we're just going to move right on in there, and we'll do it now. Now, that's theory number one, somehow to believe that white folks stopped committing crime and black and brown folks decided that it was their turn and went on some kind of crime spree. That would be theory number one. Theory number two, which I think is a little bit more deep and no doubt more accurate, is that over that 30-year period, it wasn't a matter of white crime as a share of overall crime diminishing or black and brown crime as a share of overall crime increasing, because in fact, the percentages didn't really change very much. In fact, the rate of African-American crime has not changed hardly anything in the last 25 years. But what has happened is an increased concentration of law enforcement resources in dollars, police, et cetera, in communities of color. And I would say it's not a coincidence that that happened after 1964, you see. Sort of like what Michael was talking about last night. If we're going to really get to the heart of the issue of why the prison industrial complex has grown so dramatically in the last 30 to 35 years, and why it has been a phenomenon that has disproportionately trapped not only poor folks, but specifically poor people of color, we have to recognize that in 1964, we had a very significant turning point in the middle of the 1960s, whereby formal discrimination was outlawed, so that mechanism of social control known as Jim Crow was no longer allowed. So if you have one mechanism of social control keeping certain people, quote unquote, in their place that is no longer going to be allowed, it is now outlawed. If you still nonetheless want to keep certain people in control, and that desire didn't go away just because a law got passed, you have to have a different mechanism to do it. How do you do that? Well, you increasingly criminalize certain people. And certain actions can be criminalized, and then you focus your attention on only certain people committing those actions. Because 60% of all violent crime in America is committed by white people. White non-Hispanics, 60% of all violent crime, but whites are only 23% of the persons locked up for violent crime in this country. So it isn't just that violent crime is illegal, that certain forms of violence are illegal, it's that only certain people who commit acts of violence are considered criminal. And that's even true at the street level, let alone at the level of corporate crime, which of course is not considered crime at all. It's considered malfeasance, it's considered fraud, it's considered an unfortunate byproduct of the economy. So if a company puts out a faulty product that kills thousands of people, if Ford Motor Company puts the Pinto on the street knowing full well that it's going to kill people and injure them, but decides, it would cost way too much to fix this design flaw, it would cost $13 a car, we really can't afford that, so let's just put the car out there and we'll pay off the victims of the dead, we'll pay off the families of the people injured. That's what we'll do. And Lee Iacocca is the one who made that decision. But after doing that, he wasn't looked at as a corporate criminal or a murderer, even though people did die as a result of the design flaw in the Ford Pinto. He was looked at as a potential presidential candidate. So it's not only that violence is criminalized, it's that certain people's violence is taken more seriously than other people as a mechanism of social control. The war on drugs, of course, a perfect example of that. 74% of all the persons in this country who use illegal narcotics are white like me. That's not to say that I use illegal narcotics, but I am white. Follow the analogy here. I'm not outing myself in any way with regard to that. 74% of all the illegal drug users are white, but we are only 10% of the persons locked up for drug offenses. Black folks are 14% of all drug users, roughly the same as their share of the population, but they are 74% of those locked up for a drug offense. Latinos are 10% of all drug users, but 15% of those locked up. If you add the Latino and black numbers together, you very quickly discover that Latinos and blacks are only about 24% of all drug users, about a quarter of all drug users, but they are 90% of the persons incarcerated for a drug offense. And that, more so than any other aspect of the justice system, explains the disproportionate increase since 1964 of the percentage of persons in prison who are people of color. This one policy, this war on drugs, this particular way that we have fought this war on drugs is institutionally racist and explains a lot of what is going on there. So to see that kind of thing happening and yet to believe that we are one nation, that we are united, that we are all together is, of course, completely fraudulent.
Black men found themselves suddenly disposable, no longer necessary to the functioning of the U.S. economy, precisely at the same moment that a backlash was brewing against the civil rights movement, a backlash that made it convenient for politicians to demonize black men as criminals, as shiftless, as unwilling to work. And so this war on drugs was declared, and black men found that they were no longer needed to work in the fields, no longer needed to labor in factories, and they found themselves scapegoats, pawns in political games, the enemy in a new war, and were rounded up by the millions, locked up, and then permanently locked out.
We cannot love in the way we as humans are meant to love because white supremacy has caused us to see a difference that isn't real. Another example, I think, of this is the way that we approach the opioid epidemic that we're seeing today. If you can recall the crack epidemic in the 90s, how did we respond to that? You know, it's their choice. They're making bad choices. They're using this drug. We all know that it's highly addictive and will absolutely ruin your life. Incarcerate them, incarcerate them, incarcerate them. And that's what we did. Solely approached it as a criminal justice problem. Now, today with opioid use, what's the population that's utilizing that? Largely white, largely upper class. Now we have a heart. Now we can see the full humanity of people who are having lives and choices ravaged by addiction. And now how are we approaching it? The way we should have approached crack. We are approaching it from a healthcare approach, from a law enforcement approach, and from a more holistic human approach. We as white people show again and again and again that our humanity is defective. And what I mean by that is that we cannot feel the empathy and the full humanity of people who are not white. And I know that that comes from this weight of white superiority that is ingrained in all of us, regardless of your racial status, from the moment you're born.
But one of the popular mythologies is that there are people in prison for simple possession of marijuana. If you talk to judges, if you talk to prosecutors in particular, they will tell you that the people in the California prison system, at least, who are there because of drug convictions, were not there because of simple possession. They had copped a plea. They engaged in plea bargaining. They are there because they are dealers.
Well, many of them aren't there dealers, but again, take the case of dealers. Because of prohibition, the real dealers have found it advantageous to hire teenagers because the juvenile laws punish them less severely. When Nelson Rockefeller was governor of New York, he put in especially stringent laws on drugs. But the juveniles were exempted or on a lower level. And as a result, the drug dealers switched to using juveniles. The attempt to prohibit drugs is one of the main reasons for the destruction of the ghettos in our cities. I'm sure you'll agree with that, Pete, that if you go into the ghettos, the prohibition of drugs is one of the main reasons why the prisoners in prison are disproportionately black.
Well, I think this is a separate issue. I really do, because what you're saying is an indictment that is leveled by civil libertarians with respect to the criminal justice system in general.
Yes, it is.
And the answer is the criminal law ought to be enforced in a way that's totally colorblind. If it's not, it should be.
But it's not because the civil law is not colorblind. It's because the ghettos are a good place to distribute drugs for obvious reasons. That's where you have a group that will protect themselves, that will provide protection. The customers are not black, for the most part. They come in from the outside, shop in the inner cities.
So you have a relatively lawless environment where the serious dealers can set up shop, employ gangs and kids, and it becomes a distribution center for the white people from the suburbs.
Absolutely.
That's roughly. Could we engage?
A crucial question.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Major Neil Franklin, retired from the Maryland State Police. He's also the executive director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, a group of cops, law enforcement people active and retired, who fight against the drug war and its policies. Neil, thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
You guys have created a great study that's online at LEAP's website, and you delivered a copy of this to Gil Kerlikowske, the current drug czar. What are you trying to accomplish?
One of the first things we wanted to do was put together a comprehensive look at those past 4 decades, which will focus upon financial cost, human cost, addiction.
Neil, you were at a certain point in your career, you were a drug warrior. What are the big round numbers or the findings of the war on drugs? What has it been doing, and what has it been? How has it been affecting American society?
When we first started the war on drugs, we only had a few 100,000 people in prison. Today, we're somewhere around 2.5 million people in prison. Over those 40 years, we've put over 39 million people in prison, and the vast majority of those are from nonviolent drug offenses.
So that's things like simple possession or low-level dealing.
Low-level dealing, right. We're not talking about kingpins, and even though we've arrested a few. We're looking at $1.3 trillion spent on law enforcement efforts. We're talking about cops, judges, judicial system, and prisons. That's quite costly. When you look at the number of bodies, look at Mexico. Over the past 5 years alone, since we stepped up efforts in assisting Mexico in fighting back against the cartel, you're looking at over, I think the number's like 38,000 people murdered at the hands of the cartel. In Venezuela, it's even more. In our very own country, in our neighborhoods and in our communities, every year, somewhere between 5,000 to 8,000 people murdered at the hands of our neighborhood gangs.
Why do police chiefs push back against the drug war as it's currently constituted? What's it doing to their efforts to actually control crime?
You have to think about the history of how local police got involved in this in the first place. It came from the federal government in the form of funding. Sometimes I use we bribed into getting into this war. Many police agencies now continue to balance their budgets through federal funds, through grants, burn grants, and what have you. And to lose that money would be significant, and you will hear some police chiefs speak to that. And
yet they're against the war on drugs.
Well, they say that it's failed, that it's not working. They just haven't taken the next step to move away from it, to really end it. And so they feel pressured politically, and sometimes you can't blame them, but because they care about their jobs. Politically, they're pressured to toe the federal party line.
What are the things that we can do quickly and immediately to redress that, to start fixing it and get out of this war mentality?
Well, immediately, where you don't need any legislative action whatsoever, the president can move marijuana from a Schedule I category down to a 3 or 4.
And that would mean, currently marijuana is scheduled under federal drug classifications as having no medical value whatsoever.
And then that's already been proven wrong with the 15 states that are now moving in medical marijuana, and with the many doctors behind that. But in doing that, in completely removing it from the schedule system whatsoever, then he gives the authority then to the states to move and to begin to develop models to manage marijuana within their communities. And the next important thing is it's now time for a discussion, not a debate. That's been done. A discussion as to what are the best possible models? How can we manage these dangerous drugs within our communities? We already know that prohibition does not work, so now we have to regulate and control. Let's have the discussion, come up with some solutions.
We've also been down this road before. In the 70s, we heard stories that Philip Morris had trademarked names like Acapulco Gold and Maui Wowie, anticipating the legalization of marijuana. Jimmy Carter seemed to be weeks away before a big scandal broke and pulled back from legalizing drugs in any way, shape, or form. Other countries have decriminalized. Portugal has decriminalized drugs. But are we actually at a different stage of the discussion over the drug war?
Completely different than back in the 70s for a number of reasons. Number one, we didn't have the data that we have today. Prison numbers, financial numbers, body count, we didn't have those numbers. When you look at the leaders from Mexico, the former presidents have come out with the commissioners a couple weeks ago in their report.
Yeah, we have Republican people running for the Republican presidential nomination, people like Gary Johnson and Ron Paul calling for the legalization of drugs.
But here's another significant part. They didn't have LEAP They didn't have law enforcement against prohibition back in the 70s. And we're making a significant difference because we bring a completely different perspective. We've been on the front lines, we've been out there in this battle, and we can speak from that perspective, letting people know that this is a complete failure.
If you measure drug use from whites and blacks, it's about equal by most surveys. But if you look at the prison, 4 out of 5 people in prison are black or brown. They don't have the resources. They do worse on plea bargaining. Every step of the way, they don't do as well. And the answer to it is somewhat not having such a harsh war on drugs and not putting people in prison for drug use. But the other answer is we do need to be conscious of it as far as the disparity in this. And I think it also leads to some despair, anger, and a lot of the other problems we have. And I can promise you, all you got to do is think of, if you're a rich white kid and live in the suburbs and you smoke pot in your parents' basement, what are the odds of you being caught? Almost zero. But if you're a poor kid in the city and there's no place you can go inside and you're smoking pot on a corner, you're going to be caught. And so 9 times out of 10, you're going to be caught. And the white kid in the suburbs, or rich kid, doesn't always have to be white, is not going to be caught. So this disparity adds up over time. So I'm for almost all of the criminal justice reform that you can name. Bail reform, letting people vote again, expunging records. And it's actually become a bipartisan thing. In my state, the governor is Republican, evangelical Christian, conservative as you get, but we passed an expungement bill that says, I think it's not all crimes, but for many crimes, after a certain period of time, your records get wiped clean. And from a Republican point of view that doesn't want a huge welfare state, I want people to work. If you've committed a crime, you're not going back to work if you've got a record that prevents it. And you're either going back to committing crimes, but to get people back to work, and not everybody will. I mean, a third may work, a third may commit more crimes, and a third are going back to jail. But we have a chance with some people if we'll let them have a second chance.
And now, decades later, we stand back and say, what's wrong with these people? Why are they killing each other? Why is there so much violence in these communities that we have abandoned? Communities where good schools cannot be found, but high-tech prisons are a drive away. What's wrong with them? I think the deeper question, the more profound question, is what is wrong with us?